Good morning. We begin to look at the letter of James today. Just as information, tomorrow morning I'll be on early. I'm not sure what time, 7:30 probably, somewhere in there. I'll be in Fargo for the Pride of Dakota show. Sunday morning will be on time at 9. It won't be worship from Sutton, but I'll have a devotion Sunday morning at 9, and then Monday again, should be on about 9 o'clock on Monday morning. But as we begin to look at what's called the letter of James today, this book, although it begins with the greeting, is James, a servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes of the diaspora. So it starts out as a letter, but it doesn't have a lot of other characteristics of a letter. It talks about relationships with community, which a lot of what Hebrews did as well. There's a lot of wisdom in this book of James. It's like Proverbs is one of the wisdom books. Well, James also has some wisdom in it, some single line proverbs here, admonitions to the community. He talks about responsibilities of church members, of leaders of the churches, and he talks about how sins of the community are to be dealt with by mutual confession, and so many different things that way. And also another thing that's pointed out here are the tensions between the rich and the poor, and also between the Christian and non-Christian. It's still true today that, rich people just seem to have doors open for them more easily than poor people. And, if you look at somebody that's dressed fancily, your impression of them is much different than if you see someone in ratted and tattered clothing, even though clothing with holes in the jeans and stuff is in fashion today. I think it's ridiculous, but regardless, our perceptions of someone based upon how they're dressed, how they're looked, how clean they are, especially if they smell or not, makes a lot of difference. And so James kind of points out that there shouldn't be this difference of how we treat people by whether they're wealthy or by whether they're poor or by, our opinion of them. We should treat all people the same. You're reflecting back to Jesus saying, love your neighbor as yourself. That's the greatest command, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So it points that out as well. But also, in James' day, there were the wealthy non-Christians looked down upon the wealthy Christians because they were Christians. This Christian, followers of the way, followers of Jesus were a very small minority of people, and they were not always well received. And I don't know if it's because of their enthusiasm for Jesus that they talked about Jesus, but I know that a lot of people are put off by people talking about God, by people talking about faith. And I've got my Pastor Us Workshop shirt on this morning because we're going to be going to Fargo shortly. But, in my booth, when I'm talking to people at these different shows, people talk to me about their faith. They talk to me about their church. They ask me questions about church because for some reason they see that I'm a pastor. Well, and then I get, are you a pastor? Just kind of like they're surprised that I could be. Well, I'm kind of surprised by that too, some ways. But anyway, sometimes people are off-put by other people talking about Jesus and about their faith, and we don't like anybody to get in your face about anything. But for some reason, faith and politics are two things that are just sore spots for a lot of people to talk. Anyway, we'll just carry on just a little bit further here before I look at chapter 1. Just James, the writer of this, is not James, the disciple, as James and John were the sons of Zebedee. The James that wrote this letter is one of Jesus' brothers, a son of Mary and Joseph. And, we can remember back in the Gospels when the crowds come to Jesus and say, your mother and your brothers are waiting at the door, they're looking for you. And Jesus says, well, who are my mother and my brothers and my sisters, but those who do my work? Well, James is an actual brother of Jesus who came to believe and accept Jesus as the Lord and Messiah. and became one of the leaders of the early church. And James, I mean, Paul talked about, faith and faith alone, and James points out, faith without works is dead, and we'll find that, it's not in chapter 1, but we are to be doers of the word, it says in verse 22. Be doers of the word and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. Don't just be a busybody, but be doers of the word. So, looking at chapter 1, he starts out, he introduces himself. James identifies himself. He says, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials, consider it nothing but joy, because your faith produces endurance. And maybe we don't want to have trials in our lives, but sometimes those trials remind us to lean on God, remind us to reach out to God, remind us that in all things God is with us. And sometimes I know people that have told me that, my faith grew because of this, which was not a good experience. It wasn't something that they were looking forward to in their lives, but sometimes faith grows by those things. And that's what he's saying here. It isn't, and we should never be thankful for our trials and troubles. I mean, but to look for ways within what's going on in our lives to be able to grow in faith and in our trust in God. In verse 5, he says, if any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God, and he will generously give it to you, and ungrudgingly, generously and ungrudgingly. I mean, God doesn't sit up there and say, well, I don't think I want to do that today. God is a loving, gracious God. And then he says in verse 6, ask in faith, never doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave on the sea. We ask in faith. And always, I know that our askings aren't always answered, especially the way we want them to. And there's a song, thank God for unanswered prayers. And, sometimes some of our prayers, especially as youth, our prayers aren't always maybe in our best interests. They're kind of selfish interests and stuff that way. But in all things, in faith, ask God, trust in God, knowing that God hears and listens, and even though we may not see the exact response that we want, that when we take time to talk to God, when we take time to ask God to be in our lives, and it helps us grow in so many ways. Verse 13 is another important one, and I've got it underlined and highlighted. No one, when tempted, should say, I am being tempted by God. For indeed, God tempts no one, and God himself cannot be tempted by evil. So it isn't, when we have something in front of us, it isn't God tempting us. It isn't God, saying, well, if you love me, you won't do this. No, it's Satan coming under disguise, and it's just, like in the garden, it was the serpent, Satan, in that serpent that tempted Eve and Adam. And in the book of Job, Job says, I have been faithful. God isn't doing this to me, and so it's not God tempting us. And it's just that reminder that, God isn't tempting us. And there's another misquoted verse in the Bible that God won't give us more than we can bear. But but God doesn't give it to us. God gives us the strength to get through each and every situation. God isn't giving us the temptations. God isn't giving us the cancers or the illnesses or the problems in our lives, but God is walking with us through them. Verse 17, another one that's underlined and highlighted. Every generous act of giving with every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. This is what's important. There is no variation in God. There's no shadow that's going to change. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I just commented on that yesterday, and Jill put in all of the words in the comment for as it was in the beginning, is now and ever shall be. However those aren't quite the right words either, but But it's a reminder that God is our steady rock. You know, there isn't any changing God. He is the same, and he is faithful in all things. And then verse 19, I don't have underlined, but it's, let everyone be quick to listen, listen and hear. So often when we're listening to somebody, we're not listening as much as we are thinking of the solution before we hear what's being said. And sometimes we're better off to zip our lips and let the person talk. And often, it's just being able to talk, and they'll figure out for themselves. But we can offer advice. I'm not saying that. But listen. Be quick to listen. And it's one of those things that we sometimes discount, especially like I remember when my kids were small and they'd come all excited, and sometimes I didn't really know if I wanted or had the time to listen. But it's important to listen, to take the time to listen, always. And then be slow to speak, again, listen. Listen and hear and understand. And maybe instead of spouting out the very first thing that comes to your mind, and I've done that, and then later thought, man, this is what I should have said, or even just 10 seconds later you say, oh, well, maybe this is what, So be quick to listen, be slow to speak, be slow to anger, and and it says to rid yourselves of sordidness and rank growth of wickedness, but the important thing is to listen, to be slow to speak, to think about your response. Think about, is your response going to be helpful? Is it going to be hurtful? Do they even really want your response, or do they just want and need somebody to listen and hear for a little bit? In verse 22, I already quoted earlier, it says, be doers of the word and not merely hearers that deceive themselves. But to be doers of the word. And this is tying into faith without works is dead, and that'll come up, later on. In verse 26, if any think they are religious, but do not bridle their tongues, but deceive their hearts, their religion is worthless. Religion is pure and undefiled before God, and it is this, to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. And we all know people that think they're religious, think that they are, really good. But, deep down, they're more concerned about themselves than they are about others. And, caring for the widows and the orphans, caring for those less fortunate, loving your neighbor as yourself, making sure that others have their needs taken care of and met. Those are some of the important things to do as Christians, as followers of Jesus. And so we've got some information, some wisdom about how to live our lives in community, and we will continue to do that as we continue to read through James. God's blessings again this day.